Alright, and welcome to the chocolate milk frog tutorial. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to make it look like a frog has just jumped out of a cup full of chocolate milk or hot chocolate. And he's just covered. He has chocolate dripping down the cup. There's some splatters on the cup. And here's the original stock image that I've chosen over here so you can see the before and after. Now when I picked out the image for the chocolate effect, I wanted to make sure there was some type of purpose behind it, or why I was covering this animal or reptile with chocolate or object, whatever you're going to use at home. Always make sure there's some type of purpose or meaning behind it, and that will give the overall effect just a whole different look, and it'll just be so much better if you do it that way. Instead of choosing a frog that's just sitting out in the middle of the woods, well, why is he chocolate out in the middle of the woods? I don't know, but I figured this way, if I had him sitting on the edge of the cup and he's just dripping with something, then that means there's something in the cup, and he must have just jumped out of the cup. So that's why I chose this image here. And this is the image that we're going to use for the tutorial. So let's go ahead and go through some of the files that we'll be using during this video. Inside the Adobe Bridge, if you go into the Chocolate Milk Frog folder, which is contained inside the Project Files folder on this DVD, you will find the images that I have right here. And we have a splatter image right here, which we will use for the chocolate that's splattered on the side of the cup. And we also have the chocolate cover, or chocolate color, excuse me, the chocolate color.psd file, which you can use to make sure you are always maintaining this color here, because I think that this color is extremely close to chocolate, but you can give or take, adjust the color if you want to. Here's the final image right here of the milk chocolate frog, or the chocolate milk frog, and here is the original stock image that we will be starting with for this tutorial. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to minimize this right now, and I'm going to move this, our final chocolate image here, out of the way. And let's go ahead and start on our basic stock image that we have right here. Now I chose this image just because, like I said earlier, I wanted it to make it look like the frog was jumping out of the cup that was full of chocolate milk. So whatever image you have, the very first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to crop the object or animal or whatever it is. You're going to have to crop them out of the photo. And I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that. You don't want to erase the object or animal out of the photo. You just want to copy them out of the photo, so that way you can paste them on a new layer above the original image layer. Okay, so the first thing, I'm going to go ahead and just click on the, or just zoom into the image here with the zoom tool. And I'm going to have to go ahead and start to crop this image. Now I'll go ahead and save this onto the disk if you would like to use the already cropped version. If you would like to skip this step, I'll go ahead and save the cropped version and save this inside the Project Files folder for the Chocolate Milk Frog project. Because the cropping, the cropping exercise here does take just a little bit of time, so I'm going to go ahead and fast forward, but I'm going to go ahead and start to crop right now. I'm going to select the pen tool on the toolbar, and I can basically just start anywhere on the image and make sure that I'm close enough so I can see exactly that I'm going around the object here. Now some animals and objects may be a little bit more difficult to crop than others. You might have some brush, or if you have hair, or if you have some grass, or there's things that get in the way of the objects that we want to turn into chocolate. So while you're browsing or picking out a photo for your to chocolatize whatever you want, just make sure that the object is extremely visible and there's nothing in the way of the object, and that will save you a lot of work later on when you're cropping. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and fast forward through the video Okay, I'm going to stop here a moment and tell you about a little tip. Some of the objects and animals and reptiles that we crop, many times we will have shadows on the photo as well. And that can be a little bit confusing. You know, do we crop the shadow or do we leave the shadow? Well, I'm going to make this really easy because doing it this way, the way I'm going to show you, you don't have to crop the shadow. So all we can do is just avoid the shadow, just like I'm doing here. Because we will be actually cropping this frog out of the photo. We're going to keep it in the photo, but we're just going to copy it. We're just going to copy the frog only and paste it on a layer above the original image layer that we have here. So you can just watch me. I'm completely avoiding the shadow and staying with the edge of the frog. And I'll go ahead and fast forward the video. Okay, now we're coming close to the beginning point where we started the path around the subject. So all I have to do is connect the path to where I started. And you know you're going to connect it. If you hover over the square, you'll see a little circle down on the bottom right. And as soon as you see that, go ahead and click. And you have connected the path. And I'll go ahead and zoom out here with the navigator palette, and we can see clearly now that there is a path around the frog. Alright, great. Now all we have to do is create a selection around the frog with the path, or from the path. So all I have to do is position the pen tool directly somewhere in the middle of the path and right click. Then I'm going to select Make Selection. And some options will come up on the screen. Most of the time the default options will work just fine. We won't have to necessarily feather the radius here at all, but we want to make sure that the anti-alias option is checked. And go ahead and click OK. And now you'll see a selection around the subject or object. Okay, so all I have to do now is come over here to Edit, over here to Copy, and then over to Edit once more, and then over here to Paste. And that will paste the frog above our original photo layer right here. And we can see that the frog is on its own separate layer. It's isolated from the cup. Now we can do anything to this frog, such as changing the color of the frog. I can come in here to the hue and saturation and adjust the color. But you see it does not affect the cup. It's just by itself, and you can also see that the shadows are still there even though we did not crop them. So that is why we want the frog on its own separate layer. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Alright, in the next step we are going to colorize the frog to make it have that chocolate color that we're looking for. But before I continue, I'm going to go ahead and name the layer that I have right here that we've created with just the frog. I'll double click on the name that it is now, and I'll just call it Cropped Frog, or any name that you like. You can just call it frog. There we go. And before we colorize the frog, we must remove all the color, so we must desaturate the frog completely. So I'm going to make sure that the cropped frog is selected, and I'm going to come over here to Image, adjustments, and all the way down here you'll find desaturate, and that'll just remove the color from the frog, so it should be black and white. This is exactly what we want. Okay, now we need to go back to the Adobe Bridge and browse inside the project files folder and inside the chocolate milk frog folder. We're going to find our files here, and what we need to open now is the chocolatecolor.psd file, which is right here. Okay, so just go ahead and double click and load that image into Photoshop. Go ahead and position that down at the bottom left of the screen. That way it'll always be there, and anytime you need to recall the chocolate color, you'll always have it here, and you can sample it with the eyedropper tool. Now my toolbar and the foreground already has the chocolate color because I've already done this. I'm going to go ahead and reset this right now so I can show you exactly how all this works. But what you'll want to do before you colorize the object for chocolate, you must select the eyedropper tool in the toolbar and then go ahead and click on the chocolate color image, and you'll see the foreground change to that color. Alright, now back over on the chocolate milk frog image here, and what I'm going to do is load the cropped frog layer. I'm going to load the transparency of that layer. I'm going to go ahead and hold down the Control key, which is the Command key on the Mac, and I'll get this little hand tool with a little selection on it. Go ahead and click on the thumbnail of that layer and you'll load its transparency. Do you see the selection there? Well, after I have that, I'm going to go down here and make a new layer on the layers palette. And we can go ahead and just name this layer Chocolate Color. And I'll go ahead and press the Enter key to confirm that, because what we're going to do, since we've made that new layer and we still have our selection active there, I'll go up here to Edit, over here to Fill, and then where it says Contents, you'll want to make sure that the foreground color is selected. It's the first option here and is most of the time selected by default. So go ahead and make sure that's selected, click OK, and that will fill the selection in with that color. Great. Let's go up here to Select and Deselect because we no longer need that selected. Now, well, this doesn't look like anything spectacular, so what we need to do is set an image adjustment or a blending mode on this layer. And so what I'm going to do is just come right up here to the blending mode menu, and I think I'll come down here to Hard Light, which is right here. And what that'll do is just totally convert the frog into that chocolate color that we've created. It's blending the color from this layer right here in with the one below it, and that gives that whole effect that we're looking for. So, all right, now before we continue, what I think I'm going to do is merge the chocolate color layer in with the cropped frog layer. Okay, so easy enough. Come over here to the Layers palette and come down here to Merge Down, and that will merge the activated layer down to the one below it. Watch this. There we go. So now that we have the cropped frog has the color, or it's colorized into the chocolate color, and it's just on its own separate layer here. Alright, so if you've gotten this far, well, you're probably doing pretty good. Now it's time for the next step. What we must do is smudge the frog. By smudging the frog, we can make it look more like it's coated with chocolate, because most of the time anything coated with chocolate is very smooth, has a very nice smooth texture to it. And so that's what we must do. But let's go ahead and make a new layer on top of the cropped frog layer, because I don't want to directly effect our original cropped frog layer. Just in case we make a mistake or something, we can always come back to it later. So let's make a new layer, and let's call this Smudge. And then after you create the smudge layer, all we have to do over here on the toolbar, right here, you'll find the smudge tool. Now if the blur tool is selected, it might look like this. But go ahead and click on that. You'll find the smudge tool at the bottom of that little menu that pops out. There we go. Okay, now depending on how large your object is or how high resolution your image is going to depend on the size of the brush that you're going to need to use. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and right click on the image, and for the hardness, well, we could probably turn that down for now, and I'll need to adjust the diameter of the brush as I move along while I'm smudging the image. So there's really no one set size brush for this particular frog here. I'll just go ahead and set it on 32 pixels, and we'll just go ahead and work with that. And before we move on, here's a really cool tip. Instead of right-clicking every single time you want to resize the brush, which is what I do because it's just a habit, what you can also do is use the little bracket keys next to the letter P on your keyboard. So if I click on those, you can see that it will make the brush larger and smaller very quickly. I like to use the right click because I do have the hardness controls as well as the master diameter controls. But for this project, let's go ahead and we can use the little bracket keys on the keyboard. And that's, again, that's next to the letter P on the keyboard. You should see those two keys there. Okay, let's go ahead over to the frog. Now you'll want to make sure, up here on the options bar, we have several options for the smudge tool. Make sure that the sample all layers check box is checked. You have a check in there, okay? Because what that will do is allow you to smudge the layers that are below the smudge layer, the new smudge layer that you've created here. Now the smudge strength will, it really all depends. I would go ahead and start with maybe, much lower than 90. So we're going to have to go somewhere around 45. Will work just fine. Usually 45 or 50 works pretty good for me. Okay, so after I've selected that, all I have to do is bring the paintbrush or the smudge tool over to the frog on the smudge layer and just click and move just slightly. And you can see that we are starting to smooth the outside of this frog. Now you don't want to click the mouse and hold it down too long and then go across the frog like this, because that's just not going to look very realistic. What we need to do is just click the mouse, hold it just for a second, move to the right or to the left, and you will see it just smudge it, almost similar to blurring, but for some reason using the smudge tool just gives a much better result than using the blur. See what I'm doing right here? It's actually kind of fun to go through here and do this. Now when you get into a little more tighter areas, now we can go over to those keys on the keyboard and click on those and make the brush smaller. You see that? Now I can go around the eye, smudge the top of the eye. Just make sure that any of the areas that are looking too sharp, or they have too much of a harder, or if the edges are too sharp, you'll want to go ahead and just smooth those out. Now make sure not to touch the eyes, because we're going to come back and do the eyes later on. Okay, there we go. And you may have to zoom into the image if you want. I'll go ahead and zoom in just a little bit closer here so we can see what's going on. What I like to do is I can just keep my two fingers on those keys to make the smudge tool larger or smaller. There we go. Always keep in mind when there's any time there's cracks, or there is a fold, or there is something where two things come together, you might not want to run the smudge tool over those areas. For instance, his mouth, where it closes, we want to retain the detail right where that spot is. So we don't want to go ahead and smudge over that like this, because that's just not going to look right. So what we will do is just ignore that spot and go around it like this. And don't get too close to the edge, because you could smudge the edge and it might look like that, and you don't want that either. So try to stay away from the edge as much as possible, and just come in here with the mouse. You can also use a tablet to do this, whatever you prefer. We all have different ways of using things. I've used the mouse for so long that just seems like what works best for me. So I'm just going around here, and we're just going to smudge away. Don't worry about how it looks right now too much. If this is the first time you've ever turned anything into chocolate, then you can just make this sort of like a practice run, and then redo the tutorial, come back later, and perfect your work. just going around here. Everything's looking really good. I'm going to go ahead and just try to speed up here just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. And you can see the effect that we're starting to create already. If you look at his mouth and his little head here, you can see how it's starting to almost look like chocolate, but we haven't completely done all these special effects yet, but we're getting there. There we go. Around his arm or leg. Now I'll go ahead and zoom in. I'll get to these little tighter spots here, like his fingers or his hands, and I'll go ahead and just click the bracket there to lower the size of the brush or the smudge tool just a little bit more, and I will just right along his feet here, just like that. Just make sure there's no sharp points. Everything is just very smooth on the inside, and the edge of the frog is very sharp. There we go. And I'll go ahead and hold down the space bar on the keyboard to get the hand tool, and then I can move to another area. There we go, just like that. It looks like because of the depth of field on the camera, or from when the person took the photo, there is some depth. So as we move back further on his legs in the back, they are a little bit more out of focus than his feet in the front are. So that sort of saves us a little bit more time, because these look like they have already been smudged. But it's only a blur, so we want to really give this area a real smudge. Just gonna look around the image. This looks really good. And I'll make that brush or that smudge tool just a little bit smaller. And I'll come down here. There we go. Great. Now let's look at everything here. If there's any other areas that we need to touch up, let's go ahead and do that now. There we go. Alright, let's go ahead and zoom out now and see what we have done. Great, look at that. Okay, if you like everything so far, we can go ahead and stop here with the smudging and move on with the tutorial. And you can see if I make these layers below the smudge layer, if I make those invisible, we can see that we only see the smudges that we have made, because we had the sample all layers box checked at the top in the options bar, and that's why that's good, because we have all the smudges on its own layer. So I can go ahead and make that smudge layer invisible, and we can return to the frog, the original texture of the frog. But we'll go ahead and turn the smudge layer back on. And there we have it. So we're completed the smudging process for the frog. Now let's move on to adding the drips of the chocolate to the frog. Alright, now let's begin creating the drips for the chocolate. Make sure that the foreground color still contains our chocolate color. And the next thing I want you to do is make a new layer, and we're going to call this layer drips. So I'll click on the new layer icon, I'll double click on the name of the layer, and I'll just type in here drips. There we go. Go ahead and select the brush tool on the toolbar, since this is what we'll be using for the drips for the chocolate. Next, I want you to make sure that the brushes palette is visible. An easy way to do this is just to come up here to Window and make sure the brushes option is checked right here, or you can press F5 on the keyboard. You can also come up to the options bar and you'll find a little button right here called Toggle the Brushes Palette. I'll go ahead and click on that and that'll make it appear. Now make sure Shape Dynamics is selected right here. And for the control, you'll want to set the control to Fade. By default, it might be set to off, but go ahead and set that to fade right now. Now, the minimum diameter slider here is one that you're going to be wanting to move and change pretty often while you make your drips, because you don't want all the drips to be to look the same. You want all your drips to have just a little bit of a different look to each one. So, first of all, I'm going to go ahead and just set it at about 27% right now, just to show you how this looks. But I'll go ahead and click outside of that brushes preset picker to make that go away. And I'll bring my brush over to the frog's foot right here. And I'll click the mouse, and then I'll hold down the Shift key and paint down. And that will create almost like a drip. Now it looks like the fade is not increased enough for us to get that full long drip going down the side of the cup. And that's what I'm talking about. You might need to increase the fade in order for, to have a longer drip, you'll need a higher fade value. So let's go ahead and undo that, and I'll increase the diameter of the fade. Now let's go back and try that again. I'll click the mouse, hold down the Shift key, and paint down. And look at that, it's just a little bit longer. So that looks pretty good, but I'm probably going to want to go a lot longer than that. So let's go ahead and increase the diameter a lot higher. Just about 73%. I'm going to click the mouse, hold down Shift, and paint down. There we go. Well, that looks pretty good. I can go back and touch up the foot later if I want to, but basically you get the general idea. Also make sure that the hardness is turned up. See, I didn't have the hardness turned up. And do you see how soft the edges are of the drip? Let me go ahead and undo that and watch the difference if I increase the hardness to about 90% and then click, hold down Shift, and then drag. You can see it's just the edges are much more defined there. So I like that. So just make sure that the hardness is turned up to 90 and not forget like I just did and screwed up on the video. So, but we all make mistakes, and I certainly make a lot of mistakes. So, all right, let's move on here. What we're going to want to do is make several drips over the frog. Okay, these drips won't have any highlights or anything like that. It's just going to look pretty bland for right now, but that's okay. So we'll you can zoom into the image if you like, and you can just come around the image and add the drips. And make sure you're on that drip layer. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the diameter of this, and I could probably make a really cool drip right here. I'll click, hold down Shift, and drag down. That looks pretty good. And I can make that a little bit smaller. I could come over here, or let's say I can just make it look like the chocolate has sort of came to this one spot on the froggy, and then all of a sudden it just starts to drip down. And that's going to be a little bit too long. I'll go in here and decrease the fade a little bit. And let's try that again. There we go. That may even be just a little bit too small. There we go. There we go, that's looking good. I like to go back and just do it a couple times at least to get it just right. Okay, and I'm going to put something up here by his mouth, like it looks like he's got some drips coming out of his mouth here, and so I'm just going to click right about here, and hold shift and paint down. So he's got that big drip. Better yet, I think I'll just make that a little bit thicker. There we go. Click and drag down. Perfect, perfect. Click and hold down shift. There we go. Looking good. And I'll just come around here, and we can also make it look like his foot. There's some chocolate dripping off his foot, and it's almost going like down and around underneath the cup handle here. You can see, which is definitely has a lot of blur to it. So it's you know, we can add definition later, but I wanted to make that look like it was dripping underneath the handle of the cup. And I'll just come in here and click, hold down shift and drag down right here. And I'll make the brush just a little bit smaller. And there we go. Better yet, I think I'll just make that straight on that one. There we go. Go ahead and decrease that. And he's got an elbow right here. You can see his arm is kind of sticking out. And if you're having a hard time seeing where things are, if you've smudged it a little bit too much, you can actually turn the smudge layer off, and you can almost see more of the detail of the body. But I'm just going to go ahead and just click and drag down. Of course, it's way too small. Let me go ahead and just decrease that a little bit. There we go. And click and drag down. There we go. Nice strip there. Perfect. Looking pretty general right now. That's okay. You don't have to go too crazy with the drips, but you don't want to go too little either, because the more drips you have, if you have enough drips, it's going to look like he's wet, and that's sort of the effect that we're looking for. If there's not enough drips, then it's just not going to have that chocolate wet look that we're really after. And I've used this technique. You know, if you can change the color of it, and it'll look like paint. So this is not something where it's just chocolate only. Most of what makes it look like chocolate is the actual color. So you could change the color of it, make it look like honey or paint or whatever, you know, milk or whatever you want. So, but chocolate's it's just more of a popular technique right now. So I thought I'd go ahead and use that. So we're moving right along here. We're doing really well. I noticed if you look on the bottom of the drips, most drips have this little ball sort of on the bottom, and I can show you that. I can just paint just like this little, sort of like a little ball here in the bottom where it drips down and it just kind of hangs at the bottom there. Yeah, I'm going to zoom out real quick so I can make sure that this is looking how I want. I might go ahead and just make these little lines a little bit thicker. Increase the diameter of that. There we go. I'm probably going to go in here and just turn down the fade a little bit. Looks like there's too much fade going on. There we go. You can see I'm such a perfectionist. I'll sit here and do this for hours, making it look right. It's one of those. It's, you know, when you're doing a tutorial, it's different, because especially when it comes to stuff like this, because it's mostly a trial and error type thing, and you have to actually go back and erase and do it over a few times just to get it just right. Okay, that looks really good. I'm going to go ahead and click and thicken that up a little bit right there. Yeah, whoops. Okay, let's go ahead and zoom out. That looks good. And there's one thing I want you to keep in mind that I made when I first did this. I made a mistake that I did not. Let me go ahead and just turn this down a little bit. If you can see where, if it's an area where it's not on an edge, such as his elbow, if the chocolate is just dripping out of middle of nowhere, like let's say on a flat spot on his arm, you'll want to make sure that you want to make it look like the chocolate has, whoops, that's too close. Make the chocolate look like it has ran into that area. Basically, it's just so I can round it off at the very top like this. So it looks like the start of a drip, and I'm actually way too close. There you go. You see that? You see the difference? So if I back it up a little bit, you can see this was before right here, and now that's after. It just makes it look just more realistic there. Okay, looking good, and I think I'll do the same thing on his mouth, but I don't want to get too picky or too fussy here with this right now because we're going to come back later and touch things up. I could barely see what I'm doing here because the chocolate, the paintbrush or the paint that we're using, the color is just so close to the color of the frog. It's really hard to see what you're doing. Okay. Looking good. And you see right here, don't worry, you can just paint over an area. If you've created your new drip layer, you can paint over areas while you're creating the drips. And what you can do is select the eraser tool, and you can go back and erase. So I can like go further down, and it almost looks like, now it looks like his foot has touched the cup, and then it's just dripped down from there, giving that sort of effect. That's what I really liked about this, because he's just touching the cup, and so he's just so full of chocolate. It's just everything he touches just drips down. Anyway, let's go ahead overall and look at our image here, and I'm going to go and add those little, right where, just the very bottom of the drips, just sort of has that little ball at the very bottom, like most drips do anyway. Not so much of a perfect circle, but just something like it's rounded at the bottom, and then it just kind of goes up from there. Look at that. Even the little tiny details make a difference. The more detail you do, the better. Helps the overall project. Okay, there we go. Looking good, and this is obvious. I started the drip here, like almost halfway down his little leg here. Okay. Looking good. Now let's go ahead and look at it real quick. Okay, it looks pretty good. It's got little drips and stuff, and this is just almost like just the foundation of the drip, because we're going to go and add highlights, then we're going to smudge the highlights, and then we're going to go back and erase things and things like so. But right now what we can do is touch up the drips. So let's just select the eraser tool, and with about a 70% give or take, let's just go in here and touch up, smooth out the tops of the drips. And when you smooth out the tops of the drips, it makes them blend in a little bit more. You see that? How that blends in? Like this one right here. And I could probably turn down the hardness a little bit. It's a little bit heavy. Turn this all the way down. There we go. And right here. And right here. And you can see, I mean, I'm constantly undoing, going back history states, undoing, going back history states. And if you want to know the shortcuts to go back and forth history states, they're right here. You can step backward, Alt plus Control plus Z goes backwards, and Shift plus Control plus Z will go forward a history state. Or you can just use the history palette. If you don't see that, come up here to Window, make sure history is checked, and you can just go back and forth between the steps. I like to increase this to increase my history states, the number of the history states, to 150. If I come up here to File, or I'm sorry, go over here to Edit, Preferences, in the General section, you can set how many history states you want. This is important because if you ever make a mistake, or a big mistake, an overall mistake, and you need to go back like 50 or 70 mouse clicks, well, if you have a large history state, then you can do that. There's only one thing though, the more history states you have, it uses more memory. Now, if your computer system is low on memory, then you may want to just keep this down to maybe, the average, which is just 40 or 50 history states. Because anything higher than that, yeah, it's just going to take a lot more resources. But if you do have the RAM or the memory to do that, then go ahead and crank that sucker up, because I sure like to have that just as a safety net, just in case we do make a mistake, and we all do. So this is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and continue here on to the next step. The next step, we will be adding highlights to the drips of chocolate, and we will also be adding highlights to the body of the frog. All right, before we begin adding the highlights to the drips of chocolate and the frog, what we must do is create a new layer, and we're going to call that highlights. And so this layer will only contain the highlights. Now for the highlights, we're going to use the paintbrush. So let's go ahead and select that. And then for the foreground color, let's set that to white. Now you're going to want to paint with a fairly small brush for the highlights. It's okay if it's too small for now, because later on we're going to go through and create a smudge layer for the highlights and smudge the highlights later on. So you don't have to get too picky here, but it helps if you know a few basic things that I'm going to go over real quick. But when we're going to use the highlight, or use this brush for the highlights, we're going to also want to adjust the fade like we did earlier for the drips of chocolate. And I think we're going to go ahead and begin at the very bottom of the drips of chocolate. In that case, we're going to want to decrease the diameter percentage. And I can go back and change this later, but I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in to this chocolate drip down here. And select the brush, and let's try to just paint, and I'll just do about 3 pixels. I'm going to click and just move up, and now you can see that highlight. See that? So we can do the same. I can, or better yet, what I can do is do about a 50% hardness on that brush. Make that a little bit smoother. Let me go back and just do that real quick. And I'll zoom out. And now we can do the other drips on the frog, like right here. I could just bring that brush down, and it's really small, so I'm going to have to zoom in real close here. If you're viewing this on the lower resolution, the standard definition, you can almost barely see it, so I'm just going to zoom in and go up. Basically, I'm just clicking and I'm just moving the brush to the left and then moving up. So you almost have to experiment with that just a little bit. You can even click and go up to the right in different directions on how you do the highlight, or will give a different result when you stand back to look at it. So that looks pretty good, and I can go back and just touch that up later if I want. So that looks pretty good for now. Okay, so let's move around and start adding highlights to all the drips of chocolate. Some of these drips are just so small that they almost get away with no highlight at all, but if you're a highlight freak like I am, then you gotta have the highlight in there. Like this over here, this is kind of going underneath the cup a little bit, so you may not need a highlight right there, but what I can do is place a highlight over his foot there. And also down here, because you'll want to add highlights to his body as well. Because when we converted and when we colorized this frog's body, we got rid of some of the highlights in the brighter areas, so we can go back and put those in. See, if you look at the original frog, you can load up your original photo and get ideas on where the highlights are. You can see that around the eyes and around the back. So you can keep this next to your project. Just keep that handy so you can just look over at it. And, you know, because you want to add highlights where they really need to go, because the light is shining, looks like it's shining almost at the top right down at the frog, and you want everything to look right. So it's best to use the original photo as a reference. Alright, now let's smudge the highlights after we've created the highlights, because most of the time if you just paint with a small pixel-sized brush with a bright highlight, it's just not going to look that real. It's not going to look that realistic. It's just going to be a little bit harsh. And so, I mean, you can turn down the highlight layer, but, you know. But what we're going to do is just smudge it. We can turn down the opacity of the highlight layer later on if we want to, but we're going to keep it at 100% now so we can actually see the highlights. So let's go over here, and first thing what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and make a new layer, and we're going to call this Smudge. Smudge Highlights. And let's go ahead and select the smudge tool on the toolbar, and everything looks pretty good there. Let's zoom into the image and start smudging away. And you'll just want to smooth these highlights out just a little bit. That way they don't look so chunky, you know, they just, so they're not so pixelated, they're just a lot smoother. Okay, so let's just zoom out a little bit here and check out our work. All right, looking pretty good. I can lower the smudges a little bit, and we can also lower the opacity of the highlights. And you can do these two and lower these two down until you like it. Because I like to work with the highlights really bright at first, and then later on I can just go back and lower them and fine adjust things. And there's a lot of, I can see little things in here that I could change, okay? But I want you to get the general idea of the whole thing, because that's what's most important. Okay, now let's move on to the next step. Okay, so this next step I think you might find pretty cool, but we are going to reveal the frog eyes, because as you can see, we've colorized the frog's eyes, and that's really not the effect that we were originally going to leave it as. So what we're going to do is let's just move over to the layer called cropped frog, which is right here. If you see, if I make that layer invisible, we can see the original frog eyes here behind it. So all we really have to do is make an adjustment, make a layer mask on this cropped frog layer by clicking on the new layer mask button right here. And then come over to the toolbar and select the brush tool. And right now you can turn off the fade setting for right now, because we don't need that any longer. And let's set the opacity to 100% because we're just going to do a normal paintbrush on this. It's nothing difficult or anything like that. And what I'm going to do is select the zoom tool and just zoom into the eyes. I don't have to get too close. And paint on the eyes and reveal the frogs, or reveal the actual frog's color underneath it. You see this? And you can use a soft brush or a hard brush, whatever you like. When you get around to the harder edges, then, or the more defined edges, you can increase the hardness a little bit higher if I want to get real close to the edge here. There we go. Now don't forget we have to do, now see if I just paint right along here, it doesn't look like it's much, but man, it really makes a difference when you stand back to look at all this. Okay, so the next step, well, I've decided to include this, and most people that I've showed the frog to say that it looks like it needs to have some splashes outside the cup. So I've got a killer solution for it. Let me let's go back to the file browser, and I've included a file here. The start of the file is 76009 or 29, but if you view by thumbnail, you can see that clearly that this is the splatter file. Okay, but you can go ahead and find your own splatters. All you have to do is go over to your internet browser and type in sxc.hu, and that will take you to the Stock Exchange website right here, which contains free photos. All you have to do is just come right down here, and I'll type in splat and press this button right here, and that will display a bunch of different designs, mostly around splat. Like you can put splatter, a splatted, or whatever, and you'll find ink spots and things like this. Well, we can use a lot of these for splats of liquid and for our chocolate images or for painting type images. And all you have to do is make sure before you use any of these images is just to email the actual author and ask them for permission to use the image. And to view the full version of these images, you need to have a membership, or not a membership, but you need to have a username. You need to sign in and register to get access to the full size or the full resolution images. Okay, so you can go to the Stock Exchange website. Again, that's sxc.hu, and it's right here. And if you type that in, that'll take you right to this website. Okay, so back to the file browser. What I'm going to do is double click on my splat image here. And I'm going to come up here to select all and copy that into memory. And then I'll just go over here. Well, I haven't copied it into memory yet. I'm going to go to select all. Then I'm going to come over here to edit, copy, then switch over to the chocolate milk frog and over to the channels palette. And if you don't see the channels palette, just come up here to window and make sure channels is checked right here, and it should appear. Then what I want you to do is come down to the bottom of the channels palette and just click on the new channel button right here. And the screen should go black. But all you have to do is come up here to edit and paste. So you're pasting this splatted image into a channel. Okay. Now, depending on how large your image is, mine's a pretty good high resolution image. It's not that high, but it's about in the middle. I think it's about 150 dpi or something like that. So this is just way too big for the frog here. You can see compared to the frog, that's just way too big. So what we're going to do is just go up here to edit, free transform, and resize this image here that we've pasted in the channel. So I can hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and then hold down Alt, which is Option on the Mac, and resize this down. I can pull it back, resize it down, and I can keep doing this until I feel that it's a good size. And I can resize the selection later, so I'll go ahead and just confirm that by pressing Enter on the keyboard, and I'll just go to Select, Deselect. Okay, next what we must do is invert this splatted image here that we've just pasted. So an easy way to do that is just to grab the magic wand tool and click in the black area that's around the image if you have it, and it will select just the black area. But if I come over here to select inverse, it'll just select the image. You see that? It can be a little bit tricky, but the purpose for this is that I want to invert only the image and not the background around it. So I can come over here to Image Adjustments, and down here to Invert, and up here to Select, Deselect. And if you see an outline around it, all you have to do is just grab the paintbrush and paint around that, just making that go away, because that may show up on the image if that is still there. So also after this, we're going to use the levels command to just touch up the splatting a little bit. You can see it's just a little bit gray now, but if I go into the levels command and move the white slider to the left, that will enhance the brightest areas and therefore make it more defined. Look at that. Not too high though, because it might make the edges just a little bit jagged, but that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Alright, so here's the fun part. Let's hold down the Control key, which is the Command key on the Mac. And I want you to click on the Alpha 1 channel that you've created. And now you've just loaded that channel's transparency. Well, that's great. Or loaded the channel's contents anyway. And go back to the Layers palette, or first, before you do that, click on RGB. You always have to go back to RGB mode, and then click back on the Layers palette. And I'll scroll down here and select the rectangular marquee tool and click in the middle of the selection that I've created, and I can position that, and I can actually right click in that selection and choose Transform Selection and transform the selection before I even confirm it. So I can go hold down Shift and Alt, which is Shift and Option on the Mac, and I can resize this down a little bit and just kind of imagine where these splats, where the splattered chocolate is going to be on the cup. Do I want to have a small splatter like this, or do we want bigger splatters? So it's really up to you. And you can do this like on the ground, or like on the, you can adjust the distortion or do whatever you want. But this looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and press Enter on the keyboard. Now all I have to do is create a new layer. You must create a new layer because you don't want to apply or fill the selection in with anything, because it will fill it on top of the smudge highlights layer, which we don't want to do. So before you fill your selection in with a color, let's go ahead and make a new layer. I'll double click on layer 1 and I'll just call it splatter. There we go. And all I have to do is make sure that the foreground color is the color that we've chose for the chocolate. Easy enough. I'll grab the eyedropper tool. I'll click on this chocolate color file, or the image down here that will make the foreground the chocolate color that we want. I'll come over here to Edit, Fill, and just use the foreground color for contents and click OK. And there you go. And now I'll come up here to Select and Deselect. Great, check this out. Now if you look closely, it looks like we have some of an outline from the actual layer here. You can see it's still transparent because we have some contents behind here. That's okay. I'm not too concerned about that. I can always do a whole bunch of things with that. I can just come in here and, you know, brighten this up a little bit, or I can actually just use the eraser tool and just come in here and erase that away. You see that? And no one's really going to be able to tell unless they have like a magnifying glass or something. Anyway, so we've got these splats. They don't look that great yet, because what we need to do is really decide where we want these to go. So I want this as close as possible to the frog. And you can also see the discoloration from the splats and the frog, but don't worry about that. We'll go ahead and get back to that later, because we're going to actually change the color of the frog, or the frog later on. But right at the very top here, where the splatted is starting, let me go ahead and touch this up a little bit. Right where that's starting there, what we can do is just change the hardness of the eraser and just go through here at the very top and erase away the very top of that. And make it look like it's just coming over the very top of the cup. And I could probably turn up the hardness just a little bit more. Look at that. And so there's one last thing that I want to go over, or there's actually a couple things that you can try on your images. The first one is the layer that we use to smudge the frog is set, the opacity is set at 100%. But if you lower the opacity of the smudged layer, that will allow you to bring back more texture into the frog. So if I go up here to the opacity, watch really closely. I'll go ahead and lower the opacity down, and you can start to see some of that texture come back in from the frog. That can be kind of useful because if it's too soft, sometimes it'll just look a little bit unrealistic. But if I lower the opacity, you can see a little bit of that texture come through. You see that? All right, so that looks pretty hot. So this whole time we've noticed that there is a discoloration with the frog compared to the drips and those types of things. So there's something we can do about that. If you look on the completed frog, the very first frog that I did, you can see that I've adjusted the color so just to make it look a little bit more like real chocolate milk. On this one though, it looks like it's a little bit vibrant, a little bit too much color. So what we can do, I want you to hold down the control key, click on the cropped frog layer to load its transparency, then hold down Shift. And when you hold down Shift, you'll see a little plus symbol next to the selection on the hand. If you look very closely, I'll hold down the Shift. You see the little plus symbol there? Watch, I'll do it again. See that? Now click on the smudge layer, and now you've just loaded that layer, or you've just selected that layer as well. Click on the drips, click on the highlights layer, click on the smudge highlights layer, and now you've selected the frog and all the drips of chocolate that are coming off the frog. So what we can do now is click on the topmost layer and then come down here, and let's see, I don't even have to hold down any keys. I can just come down here and click on the Create New Fill or Adjustment Layer option and select Hue and Saturation. Now if I adjust the saturation, that will change the entire frog. Look at that. Now you can have a black and white frog if you want. Now you can really, screw with things here. You could make it look like paint. You can really do whatever you want. Blue paint. So there's so many cool things you can do here. But we're going to focus on chocolate. And now, before it was pretty vibrant, but I think chocolate it's just a little more flat. And it almost sort of looks like this. This is before, and this is after. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And let's zoom out of the image here and see what we got. Check it out. The frog has jumped out, and he's got everything all wet. So there you have it. That's just the basic way to really add or to turn things into chocolate. Now I could spend a little bit more time on this, touching up certain areas. I can see those areas right now. But you generally get the idea on how we can do this, and the possibilities are endless, really. You can take any object or basically anything. You can put something on your desk, take a picture of it in good lighting, and add the drips of chocolate. Go back to this file if you need to. Look at the layers. Remember the layers that we've used, the drips, the highlights, the smudge highlights, the splatter effect. Okay? And don't forget the last effect that we did when we held down the Shift key and then the Control key, and we've clicked on all these layers, and we've loaded all the layers, the transparency of all the layers, which will select the entire frog. And then all we have to do is add an adjustment layer, come in here, and basically just make the color anything we want. So sky's the limit. There you go. Go out and create some chocolate frogs. We'll see you guys on the next video.